No one marries a fat girl, sir. But I can cook, the shy bride said. The rancher's reply changed her life. Wyoming Territory, December 1879. The wind was a predator, clawing at the worn edges of Powder Creek, a town stitched together with grit and desperation. Snow drifted in lazy spirals over the brittle grass and rattling fences, settling heavy on rooftops and shoulders alike. It was the kind of winter that turned breath to frost and men to ghosts. Horses huffed plumes of steam, and guns were tucked under coats like promises waiting to be kept. In a small cabin on the edge of town, where the land sloped toward the frozen creek, a woman stood alone at a wood-burning stove. Edith Mayburn, 27 years old, stirred a pot of rabbit stew, her hands calloused from a life of labor. The scent of thyme and bone broth filled the cramped space, chasing away the silence that had become her only constant companion. She had lived alone for nearly 5 years, ever since leaving the orphanage. There, the kitchen had been her sanctuary, a place where she learned to bake, boil, and brine, shielding herself from the cold and from cruel words. The people in Powder Creek spoke her name in whispers, if they spoke it at all. The fat girl in the cabin, they'd say. Kind heart, poor figure, children would point. Shopkeepers gave her the worst cuts of meat. She smiled anyway, traded fresh bread for buttons and dried herbs, and kept to herself. This morning the cold felt sharper than usual. Edith pulled her shawl tighter, leaning into the fire's warmth. Then she heard it. 3 hard knocks on the door. Not hesitant, not polite. The kind of knock that belonged to a man who did not repeat himself. She hesitated, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened the door. Standing there was a man wrapped in a thick wool coat, snow clinging to his boots and the brim of his hat. His face was shadowed, but his eyes were sharp, taking in the small cabin, the warmth behind her, and Edith herself. He removed his hat slowly, revealing dark hair flecked with silver at the temples. "Are you Edith Mayburn?" he asked. His voice was low, edged with weariness. "Yes," she replied, her voice small. "Can I help you?" The man gave a single, curt nod. "Name's Colter Grady. I run the Grady Ranch west of here. Lost my cook 2 days ago. Sickness. Men are hungry, and hungry men are useless." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I heard you can cook." Edith's mouth went dry. She glanced back at the bubbling pot, then back to the stranger. His coat was dusted with the salt of the trail, his hands large and weathered, the kind of hands that could break a wild horse or bury a man with equal ease. "I can," she said carefully. He tilted his head. "Can you cook for 20 cowhands?" Her breath caught. 20. She had never cooked for more than 6 at the orphanage. Her heart thudded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked past him, into the endless snowy plains. Then her gaze fell downward, to herself. In the bent reflection of a tin ladle hanging by the door, she saw what everyone else saw. Round cheeks, full arms, wide hips. A body shaped more by flour sacks and heavy pots than by corsets and cording. A familiar knot of shame twisted inside her chest. Years of cruel words surfaced like old bruises. She met his eyes, then quickly looked away. "No one marries a fat girl, sir," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "But I can cook." The words hung in the cold air between them, bare and trembling. She expected him to turn away, to offer a curt apology or a dismissive laugh. But Colter Grady didn't move. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. Then he said softly, "I'm not hiring a wife, Miss Mayburn. I'm hiring someone who knows how to feed a man in a way that reminds him life is still worth waking up for." Edith blinked. Her hands, still floured from the morning's biscuits, trembled slightly. She didn't know what to say. Colter placed his hat back on his head, nodded once, and turned to go. "I'll be back at first light," he called over his shoulder. "If you're willing." And with that, he walked back into the snow, leaving Edith standing in the doorway. The warmth of her hearth reached no farther than the frame, but something else lingered. His words, heavy and honest. "I'm not hiring a wife." For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. The dawn over Grady Ranch came slow and heavy, pressing down on the land like a wool blanket soaked in ice. The sky was the color of iron, and the wind carried a cruel edge that cut through coats and cracked lips raw. A thin, bitter snow had fallen in the night, dusting the rooftops and fences. Smoke curled from the bunkhouse chimneys like question marks against the gray sky. Edith Mayburn sat in the back of the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, her heart thudding like a war drum. The driver, a young ranch hand named Will, had barely spoken. He'd helped load her trunk, glanced sideways at her once and muttered, "Hope you ain't too soft for this place." When the wagon rolled to a stop, Edith stepped down into a world that didn't seem to want her. The ranch sprawled before her. 3 barns, a corral thick with cattle, a low-slung bunkhouse, and the main house standing sternly at the edge of the horizon, as if it owned the land and everything breathing on it. This was a place built by strong hands and hard years, and now all those strong hands were watching her. The cowhands stood in loose clusters, arms folded, leaning against fence posts. Their faces were hard with winter, their skin burned by wind and weather. They didn't hide their reactions. "Well, hell," one man chuckled, nudging his friend. "She's gonna eat more than she cooks." Another laughed, loud and sharp. "Hope we ain't paying her by the pound." Edith's cheeks flamed, but she didn't flinch. She didn't run. She held her head high, her gaze steady, and walked straight toward the kitchen house without a word. Her boots crunched in the snow. Her coat flapped at her sides. The whispers followed her like stray dogs, but she refused them the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside, the kitchen was bone-chillingly cold. The fire in the hearth had long died out. Edith moved as if she had always belonged there, opening cabinets, checking stores, dragging logs to the hearth. She struck flint to steel until a new fire roared back to life. Her hands, practiced from years at the orphanage and her own small hearth, moved with purpose. She unpacked her knives, her spices, her heavy cast-iron skillet. By sunrise the next morning, the air was thick with the scent of roasted cornmeal, crushed chili, and butter melting into hot stone. She had risen before the sun to set her plan in motion. Cornbread, but not just any cornbread. Her specialty, spicy cornmeal cakes, pan-seared in lard until they were crisp on the outside and warm within, served with a thick cream sauce flecked with smoked pepper and a hint of nutmeg. She laid out 20 plates with practiced grace. The bunkhouse bell rang. Boots thundered on the porch. The cowhands clomped into the dining hall, laughing, yawning, slapping snow from their coats. Then they smelled it. The room fell strangely quiet. One by one they picked up their plates. No one said a word, not even the men who had mocked her the day before. Edith stood behind the serving table. her hands clasped behind her back, watching. She felt their eyes on her, but more than that, she watched their mouths. Chewing slowed, heads tilted, eyes widened, silence. Until one man, the one who'd made the loudest joke about her weight, walked back to the table, his plate scraped clean. He stood there for a beat, awkward and hesitant. Then, without looking her in the eye, he held out his plate again. He said nothing, just waited. Edith took the plate with steady hands and spooned him another helping. Still not a word passed between them, but as he turned to leave, she caught the corner of his mouth twitch upward, just for a second. Outside, the sky was still gray, but inside that kitchen, something warm had begun to rise. The first week passed in a blur of frost-bitten mornings and long, oil-lamp-lit nights. Edith rose before the roosters, often before the moon had fled the sky, and didn't rest until the last pot was scrubbed and the embers glowed red in the banked hearth. But she did more than cook. She watched. She listened. Jed, the lanky hand with the crooked nose, didn't like onions. Amos, the wiry one who rarely spoke, always rubbed his wrist at the table. She soon realized it was a pepper allergy, and little Sam, no older than 16, tiptoed into the kitchen past midnight for cold biscuits when he thought no one was looking. She started leaving 2 wrapped in cloth near the edge of the counter. He never said thank you, but the napkin was always returned, folded neatly, by morning. Every man had a story hidden in his silence, and Edith paid attention. Slowly, they began to notice. The teasing died down. The jokes faded. In their place, small gestures bloomed like desert flowers after a rare rain. A buttercup left on the windowsill. A carved wooden spoon, rough but earnest. Someone fixed the creaky hinge on the pantry door. No one ever said they were sorry for how they had treated her. They didn't have to. Edith understood the language of silence, and kindness, from men who lived by guns and cattle, often came without words. Colter Grady, for his part, said little. He ate every meal with the hands, always taking his plate last. But each night, when the others had drifted off to the barn or the bunkhouse, Colter remained. He would roll up his sleeves, step into the scullery, and wash the dishes. The first time, Edith tried to stop him. "You're the boss," she said quietly. "You don't have to do that." "I know what I have to do," he replied, his voice low but not unkind. "You fed them. I'll clean up after." And that was that. They rarely spoke, but she grew to know the rhythm of his presence. Quiet, steady, unyielding. When he passed her a towel or stacked the pans with care, she felt the strange ache of something she couldn't name taking root between them. Then came the storm. It blew in like a whisper from the north, then roared down upon the ranch with the fury of a scorned god. The wind howled through the eaves, tearing at barn doors and sending the cattle into a panic. Men shouted over the gale. Hooves thundered. Edith stayed in the kitchen, bolting shutters, stoking the fire higher. Snow slapped the windows so hard it sounded like fists trying to break in. That was when she heard it. A sound just barely louder than the wind. A child's voice, weak and high-pitched. "Hello?" Her heart stopped. She grabbed her shawl, unlatched the door, and braced herself against the screaming wind. Visibility was almost nothing, just a swirling chaos of white. But the voice came again, closer now. "Please." Then she saw him. A boy, no older than 7, his skin the color of sun-warmed clay, his black hair matted with ice. He wore only a thin shirt and torn moccasins against the blizzard. Edith didn't think. She rushed into the storm, scooped him into her arms, wrapped him in her shawl, and carried him back into the warmth, slamming the door behind them. She set him by the fire, his tiny body trembling like a leaf. "Where are you from?" she whispered, rubbing his arms, trying to will the heat back into his limbs. The boy didn't answer. He just shivered and clung to her, his eyes wide with fear. A shadow filled the doorway. Colter. Snow clung to his coat, his face flushed from the cold, his breath ragged. He didn't speak. His eyes moved from the boy to Edith, to the shawl soaked with melting snow. Edith stood protectively, her arms still around the child. "He was hurt," she said softly. I had to." Colter stepped closer, crouching slowly by the hearth. He reached out a calloused hand and gently touched the boy's shoulder. "You did right," he said, his voice a low rumble. His eyes met hers, quiet and unreadable. He nodded once and helped her build the fire higher. No other words were spoken that night. But for the first time, when Edith looked at Colter, she didn't just see a rancher. She saw a man who had seen her in the storm and stayed. Morning broke over Grady Ranch in muted shades of silver and blue. The storm had passed, leaving a fragile silence in its wake. A fresh blanket of snow covered every rooftop, every fence post, muffling the world into stillness. Inside the kitchen, the fire had burned low. Edith sat near it, wrapped in a quilt she barely remembered fetching. The child had been claimed at dawn by a neighboring Lakota family who had come searching. Edith had handed him over gently, the way one might return a piece of their own heart. Now, she sat alone, her hands curled around a tin mug of lukewarm tea. She didn't hear Colter come in, but she felt his presence, as sure and quiet as winter. Without a word, he stepped behind her and draped a heavy woolen blanket across her shoulders. It was thick, warm, and smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. His hand lingered for the briefest moment before he stepped away. No words, no glances, just the weight of something gentle, settling between them like snow that refused to melt. After that morning, something began to shift. Not all at once, but in small, unspoken ways. They started crossing paths more often. Colter helped her carry water buckets from the creek when the pump froze over. She hadn't asked. He simply appeared beside her one morning, grabbed the second pail, and walked in silence. One afternoon, while they gathered firewood side by side, Edith slipped in the slush and let out a startled laugh as she tumbled into a snowbank. When she looked up, Colter was smiling. Not a full grin, but the ghost of one, real and rough around the edges. Later that week, a barn cat leapt into an open sack of flour, sending a white cloud everywhere. Edith gasped. Colter blinked. Then he chuckled, a low, warm sound that surprised them both. They laughed until tears burned their eyes. For once, it didn't matter that her cheeks were red or her apron was a mess. She laughed like a woman who hadn't been laughed with in years. But for Edith, the change was more than shared chores or soft glances. It was the way her hands trembled when he passed her the bread knife, the way her chest tightened when he looked at her and didn't look away, the way she caught herself hoping he'd stay just a moment longer. She had never felt this before, not from any man. She had always been the cook, the helper, the quiet one in the corner. Never the woman someone saw, until now. And it terrified her. That night, Snow still clung to the eaves as the moon rose in a wide, pale sky. Edith went out to the storage shed to fetch dried herbs. The cold bit through her shawl as she fumbled with the latch. "Edith!" She turned. Colter stood there, a lantern in one hand, the other holding something wrapped in oilskin. "I was looking for you." She straightened, trying to read his face in the dim light. He stepped inside the shed, set the lantern on a barrel, and held out the parcel. "What is it?" she asked, her voice small. He carefully unfolded the oilskin, revealing a worn leather notebook. The edges were scuffed, the corners dog-eared, the cover soft from years of touch. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She used to keep recipes, thoughts, little things she didn't want to forget." Edith reached for it, hesitant. He didn't let go. "She told me once," Colter said, his voice low and steady, "that love doesn't come from the eyes. It comes from what's left after the meal is gone." Edith swallowed hard. The warmth in the small shed seemed to rise, though the air was frigid. Colter finally released the book into her hands. "I figured you might like to add to it." She looked down at the notebook, then back up at him. His face was quiet, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something raw, something real. Edith nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. And for a long time they stood there in the half-light of the shed, two people shaped by silence, beginning to find their words in each other. The thaw came slowly that spring, but it came. Snow pulled back from the hills like a tired tide, leaving behind mud, new blooms, and rumors. At first, they were just whispers in Powder Creek's mercantile and barber shop, that the cook up at Grady Ranch had the boss staying late in the kitchen, that perhaps Colter Grady had lost his mind, or at least his standards. "That fat girl's got something special in her stew," one man laughed over a bottle. The town was small, mouths were quick, and bitterness traveled faster than any horse. Then came Caroline. She arrived in a fine carriage, her boots too clean for the muddy roads, her eyes too sharp for any real warmth. Her dark hair was pinned high and tight, her lips painted a shade of red that looked unnatural here. The townsfolk remembered her well. Caroline Ash Grady, the belle who had left town with the banker after Colter lost his first cattle drive to a drought. And now she was back. Edith saw her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon, standing on the church steps in a green velvet dress that didn't belong to this land. Carolyn's gaze scanned the faces exiting the chapel until it landed on Edith. She smiled, but there was no kindness in it. None at all. The next day, Carolyn rode up to Grady Ranch without warning. She stepped from her horse as if she owned the soil, waving at the hands who paused mid-task to stare. Colter met her on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest. Whatever they said was quiet, tense. Then Caroline marched toward the kitchen. Edith had just pulled a golden-crusted apple pie from the oven. She looked up as the door swung open. Their eyes met across the warm, fragrant air. Caroline looked her over once, slowly, the way a seamstress might measure a sack of flour. "So this is who you settled for," she said, her voice carrying clear to the stable hands. "I suppose when a man's pride breaks, he reaches for comfort food." Edith said nothing. Her hands clenched the edge of the wooden counter behind her, knuckles white. Her heart was a hammer against her ribs. "Do you know what they call you in town?" Carolyn's smile was a cruel, beautiful slash. The hog with the hearth. A pig in an apron, as I hear it. A wave of laughter drifted in from the courtyard. Edith didn't know if it was for her. It didn't matter. She turned and fled, bursting through the back door and not stopping until she reached the edge of the woods, where stubborn patches of snow still clung to the shadows. She collapsed beside a frozen stump, trembling, her breath a knot in her throat, a sob that refused to be born. She had tried. She had been kind and quiet and hard-working, and still, it wasn't enough. Perhaps it never would be. She didn't hear the crunch of boots on the frozen ground. Edith! She spun around. Colter stood there, his face a thundercloud of something not quite anger, but terrifyingly close. She swiped at her wet cheeks. I should go, she whispered. I ain't worth this kind of mess. He shook his head, a single sharp motion. You think I care what that woman says? She's beautiful, Edith said, the word tasting like ash. You loved her once. I thought I did, he replied, his voice rough. Before I knew the difference between a man who is wanted and a man who is used. He stepped past her then, his long strides carrying him back toward the ranch house. Half in fear, half in awe, she followed. He walked straight into the courtyard, where a half-dozen hands had gathered near the barn, and where Carolyn still stood, preening as if she held court. Colter stopped in the center of them all. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cold air like a blade. Caroline, he said, you left me because my pockets were empty. Edith stayed because her heart is full. A murmur rippled through the men. Colter's gaze swept over them, fierce and unyielding. Any man here who mocks the woman who's fed him for months can find a new place to work by sundown. Silence fell, absolute and heavy. Even Caroline was frozen in place. Colter turned back to Edith, and there, in front of every smirking hand and every wide-eyed onlooker, he took off his hat. He stepped close, his voice dropping for her alone. You want to go, Edith. I won't stop you. But if you stay knowing this. I choose you. Not out of pity, not for the food you cook, but because you are the only person who's ever looked at me and seen the man I was trying to be. Her breath hitched. The tears came again, hot and fast. But this time they were not born of shame. And all around them, the ranch was perfectly, utterly still. The spring rains came late that year, and they brought something worse than mud. It began with one of the younger hands, a wiry boy who collapsed after breakfast, shaking with fever. By sundown, 2 more had fallen ill. By the next morning, half the bunkhouse was a chorus of groans, the air thick with the scent of sickness. The doctor from Powder Creek rode in once and left twice as fast. Bad meat, he declared, his face grim. Came in on the last supply wagon. It's spreading. Keep them hydrated. And pray. Prayers were a scarce commodity on the frontier. What the ranch had was Edith. She rolled up her sleeves, tied a clean rag over her mouth and nose, and lit every burner in the kitchen. For 3 nights, she did not sleep. She did not stop. She boiled oats into a thin, nourishing porridge and mixed powdered charcoal into tonic water. She took advice from the Lakota woman who lived upriver, scribbling down remedies with a shaking hand. Boil willow bark for the fever, use yarrow to stop the bleeding, brew tea from sage and birch. Her apron was soon stained with broth and the sweat of other people's fevers. Colter helped where he could, hauling buckets of water, cleaning bedpans, holding a head as a man heaved his guts out. But the kitchen, the heart of the fight, that was Edith's domain. She didn't leave it, not once until her body betrayed her. It was the fourth night. She was ladling soup when her vision swam, the edges turning dark. The spoon clattered to the floor. She reached for the counter, but her body gave out before her will did. She fell hard, the world spinning into blackness. When she woke, the light was soft and golden. A heavy quilt was tucked to her chin. A fire glowed in the hearth, and Colter was there, sitting on the floor beside her bed, his back against the warm stones. He looked exhausted, but in the depths of his eyes, something new and gentle had taken root. She tried to speak, but he hushed her with a slight shake of his head. "You saved them," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Every last one." Her lips trembled. "I couldn't do more." "You did everything." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "I watched you wear yourself to the bone for men who used to laugh at you, for a ranch that was never kind, for a man who took too damn long to say thank you." She blinked, a tear tracing a path to her temple. Colter's voice dropped, becoming barely more than breath. "If you are the hearth that keeps this place alive, Edith, then I will be the roof." He squeezed her hand. "I'll keep the storm off your back. I swear it." Edith didn't answer. She couldn't, not with words. But her fingers curled around his, and in the quiet of that room, something stronger than any fever passed between them. By midsummer, the ranch had found its rhythm again. The pound of hooves on hard-packed earth, the echo of hammers on barn walls, the sound of laughter rising from the bunkhouse. Edith was walking again, her strength returning in slow, steady waves. The hands would stop her as she passed, offering shy nods or awkward words of praise. Some brought gifts, a handful of wild plums, a river stone polished smooth, a wooden spoon carved into the shape of a heart. But it was the apron that left her speechless. She found it one morning, folded neatly on her work table. It was made of deep green linen with soft, sturdy ties. Stitched across the front in careful golden thread were the words, "The Keeper of Home's Taste." Beneath them, every hand on the ranch had signed his name, even little Sam's, in a crooked scrawl. She pressed the fabric to her chest, and for the very first time in her life, felt not just seen, but cherished. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, Colter found her behind the barn. "Come with me," he said. She followed him up the ridge behind the ranch, the same ridge where winter storms once gathered like ghosts. Now it was bathed in the orange and gold of sunset, the tall grass whispering against their legs. At the top, the world fell away. The ranch glowed below, a patchwork of fields and fences, smoke curling from chimneys, cattle grazing in the distance. Edith breathed it all in, her eyes shining. "I used to come up here when I'd forget why I started all this," Colter said quietly beside her. "I don't forget anymore." She turned to him. He held his hat in his hands, his face more open than she had ever seen it. "I don't want a proper wife, Edith. Not the kind they write poems about. Not one who fits in a society dress. I want someone who gives like you do. Someone who wakes up thinking about other people's hunger and ends the day full of purpose. I want you." She froze, the words caught in her throat. I never thought I was someone a man like you could love." Colter stepped closer, his voice low and steady as the earth beneath their feet. Then let me cook us a life, Edith, one where you're never hungry for love again. The sun slipped behind the hills, casting the world in long shadows. But in that moment, all she felt was light. A year later, the Grady Ranch was known for more than just its cattle. People rode in from 10 miles around, not to buy stock, but to eat. Tucked beside the main barn, under a new awning draped in wildflowers, stood a small eatery with a hand-painted sign. Iron pot and painted heart. The name had stuck. Inside, long wooden tables were lit by candles melted into glass jars, and the air always smelled of cornbread, spiced stew, and something sweeter, something that smelled like belonging. Edith ran the kitchen with her usual quiet grace. But now, a smile rarely left her face. Her green apron, the one bearing the embroidered words, was her uniform. When someone called out, "Ma'am," it was no longer a formality. It was a title of respect. "Mistress," the ranch hands called her, their grins full of pride. The same men who once laughed behind her back now lined up for a second helping of her hickory chicken. And Colter? Every night, after the last dish was served, he would roll up his sleeves and head for the dish basin. He still washed every plate by hand. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he'd pull a sprig of wild mint from his pocket and tuck it gently behind Edith's ear as she wiped down a counter. She never stopped blushing. One evening, Edith sat alone at a table, a letter spread before her. In the flickering lantern light, she dipped her pen and began to write. It was a reply to a girl from a neighboring town who had asked, timidly, how she could ever be loved when boys only laughed at her shape. Edith stared at the girl's words for a long time. Then she wrote, "I used to believe the same. I thought love was only for the slim, the shiny, the bold. I thought I had to wait for someone to choose me before I could belong. But that was before I learned the secret. You don't wait for love to find you. You become love. You pour it into your cooking, your kindness, your stubborn hope. You feed the world with the fire in your own heart. And one day, someone good and true might just smell the warmth coming from your kitchen and decide to stay." She ended the letter with a smile and one last line. "Don't wait to be chosen, sweetheart. Choose yourself first. The right person will choose you too." She sealed it with wax and stepped outside. Above, the stars blinked like a million stories waiting to be told. And inside, the fire in the hearth still burned bright. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that love doesn't follow rules of appearance or station, then this is your sign to believe again. Because somewhere out there, someone is still choosing kindness, still believing in a slow, steady love, still stirring a pot that is meant to feed not just the body, but the soul. If you felt the warmth of Edith's courage and Colter's quiet devotion, tap that hype button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Here we tell the tales where bullets missed, but hearts never did. New stories every week of love that defied storms, shame, and the long silence of the prairie. Subscribe now and ride with us into the heart of the untamed West.